Hello and welcome to Queen's University Belfast's Research to Reality Roundtable. Today we're going to be hearing directly from Queen's academics and researchers on how they're addressing real-world problems. We'll dive deep into their work, which covers topics as diverse as ancient bogs and alien invaders. We'll explore the challenges they face and the solutions they're developing. I'm Mark Devenport, and in this roundtable we're focusing on how academics from both the School of Natural and Built Environment and the School of Biological Sciences are helping tackle threats to our environment through research with a specific focus on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 14, Life Below Water, and Goal 15, Life on Land. Joining me today are Professor Maarten Blaauw from the School of Natural and Built Environment and Professor Jaimie Dick and Dr. Ross Cuthbert from the School of Biological Sciences. Ross, maybe if I can start with you, if you could just give listeners and viewers a sense of your background. I know that you're the only one here who's actually an alumni of Queen's.
Yeah, so I started my journey as an undergraduate in archaeology and palaeo-ecology at Queen's, studying geography, where I did a variety of subjects from geoforensics through to geopolitics, glacial geomorphology. I then transitioned into ecology with a master's at Queen's in ecological management and conservation biology, transitioning then into biological sciences. And then from that, I moved into a PhD in the same department, working on the ecology of insect species such as mosquitoes and the diseases that they transmit.
Maarten, you came here actually then from the Netherlands, which was where you began your academic journey. What attracted you to Belfast?
So we have a very famous radiocarbon lab in Belfast, which was built in the 1960s, and it's very famous across the world. So what attracted me to come to Belfast.
This is one of only, I think, 4 similar labs in the whole of the UK, and it's like a precise clock, if you like, for determining the age of prehistoric things.
Yeah, back to around 50,000 years old. It's for archaeology, but also for geography, actually, landforms, paleoecology. It can also be used for forensics. Every now and then we get forensic cases as well. And yeah, so that's all very fascinating. And I mostly enjoy working on trying to get a handle on the uncertainties related to all these measurements and how to interpret them.
Now, Jaimie, like Maarten, and indeed like myself, you're a blow-in, but like myself, you've been here quite a long time. You came over from Scotland in the 1980s, I gather.
That's right, Glasgow University, where I did zoology and botany, and a project on animal behaviour, behavioural ecology, which brought me to PhD at Queen's, which continued the theme of animal behaviour. Funnily enough, I was studying the sex life of shrimps in local rivers when I discovered an invasive species was part of the cycle of cannibalism and predation, and this was explaining how the local shrimps were disappearing. So that got me very interested in the impacts of invasive species, and Ireland is a particularly good place for that because we have quite a lot of nasty invasive species and more arriving. And that led into a lot of projects across groups from deer to mosquitoes, across freshwater, marine and terrestrial habitats, and moving across the world, for example, the Great Lakes of North America. We study invasives in South Africa, Australia, and Queen's has been a place that we've sort of been able to move across the world with various grants and funding and PhD students and make a global sort of contribution to the invasive species issue.
Now, we're obviously got time in this discussion to explore some of those international connections, but I mean, on your doorstep is the Queen's Marine Biology Centre, where you spend a lot of your time, which I should explain is on the coast of Strangford Lough, and that's quite an extraordinary place to be based, isn't it?
It is, and it has 2 faculties, about 5 schools within the university all operating down there, from renewable energy through to our mosquito lab. We're doing a big project on marine biodiversity, including mapping the invasive species around Northern Ireland, funded by lots of locals such as DAERA and funders such as NERC. And we have a diverse group of people working on interdisciplinary projects. So we could have chemists rubbing shoulders with engineers, with biologists, and it's a fantastic multidisciplinary place to work. And again, that has global reach with the global issues we face, and we're tackling global issues in our local Queen's Marine Laboratory.
Coming on to your current research, obviously invasive species crop up everywhere, on land, underwater. Right now, what are you looking at?
Well, we have a range of projects. For example, one of the big issues is invasive plants, which are moving into our woodlands and across agriculture, causing problems with our pollinators. So we've some innovative projects running at the moment looking at how to tackle invasive plants, particularly in a changing environment with respect to the removal of glyphosate, what you might know as Roundup, which is generally used to get rid of these plants. That's going to go. It's gone in many councils already. So we're looking at ways of tackling these invaders with environmentally friendly off-the-shelf techniques such as temperature shock and replanting with native seeds to try and get priority effects, using ecological theory to wipe out the invader by using our native species. We're working on eel migration to the Sargasso. We're working on deer ecology, badger populations. There's a whole range of different challenges we face, big questions, human-wildlife conflicts, invasive species, and we take those big questions and we translate them into research locally and internationally.
Ross, I mean, you came from a sort of geographical background, but you've almost got more into the economics of some of this recently, I gather, in terms of trying to quantify, if you like, the potential financial cost of things like species invasions.
Yeah, I mean, I think geography is tremendously broad. So our field in terms of invasion science is very interdisciplinary. I work a lot on biological invasions with Jaimie. And through that, I've worked with a lot of economists and social scientists and learned a lot from them. They often speak a bit of a different language. But yeah, we've been working on projects where we've been compiling the economic costs of biological invasions. So trying to communicate what impacts they have in a way that's easily understood by decision makers and the general public, because most people understand the value of money. So we've been compiling resources which quantify the economic impacts of invasions around the world, putting a cash value on their environmental effects to try and motivate better management actions ultimately.
Any examples of those kind of cash values that you can give us now?
Well, at the global level, we find that invasions cost over $1.2 trillion in the last 6 decades. Yeah, a huge sum, and it's rising exponentially. Around the world, we have over 30,000 invasive species, and the number's rapidly increasing. We're moving things around the world farther and faster than ever before with a very globalized trade and transport network. So things are constantly arriving, and some of these new arrivals have severe impacts on the environment and the economy. So I mean, locally, some examples are Japanese knotweed, which has implications for buildings. There's other things like invasive mosquitoes, which are spreading rapidly across Europe, which are vectoring diseases which haven't been here before, such as dengue. So there's a whole range of things which are causing issues and require attention.
Maarten, we've got sort of two experts in invasive species on either side of you. That's obviously one major environmental challenge. The other challenge that obviously everyone is talking about the whole time is global warming. Some of your work, I know, has shed light on the pace of global warming and particularly the role of peatlands in relation to this. Can you explain how your chronological work has managed to, if you like, focus attention on that?
Things are changing very quickly now, and say since 1950 there's been an exponential increase in so many factors, pollution, human footprint, and also in terms of radioactive isotopes, which I find interesting because we can use those peaks in radioactive isotopes actually as markers for the start of that period. So it's really good to see how fast species are changing or how fast impacts are progressing. And the past can tell us a bit more about how fast events happened in the past, say on natural changes, for example, and we can compare with what we are doing nowadays.
So you're able, for instance, and this was one of the studies you took part in, to take, if you like, a core out of a piece of peatland and try and work out what has been the changes over time. And you found that a lot of the peatlands, not just in Ireland, but also around the Northern Hemisphere, have been drying up at quite a rate in recent centuries, which is worrying because they store a lot of carbon within them.
Yes, and the carbon, if it starts evaporating, and it can evaporate as CO2 or as methane, and methane is much more destructive. So we're doing a lot of research on how bogs are doing currently. There might be an optimum level of wetness, perhaps, so too dry and there would be too much oxygen entering the bog and decomposing the peat. Too high and you might have more methane emitted. At the same time, we're also cutting down peat. We're draining peatlands. And if you just check a map of aerial photos of blanket peat, for example, huge scales of blanket peats you can see there's tiny drains where all those peatlands have been just drained for whatever reason and are now then perhaps emitting carbon.
And your precise record that you've been able to compile of what has happened to peatlands in the past is maybe a bit of a predictive tool then for the future, and also a source of a warning, I suppose, to us as to what might happen.
Yeah, because we from the fossils or subfossils that we find within peat, we can reconstruct how wet, how dry the bog was. But at the same time, we can also we can find out when those changes happened, but also from the pollen record. We can get like a landscape scale idea of what humans were doing at the same time. So you might have a collapse in a society, say Bronze Age Irish collapse, and that would be interesting to see what happened to the people. Why is there suddenly much fewer people around in Ireland 3,000 years ago or so, 2,500 years ago? What were the potential causes? So then you can use peat bogs, the fossils within them, to get an idea of the timeline and possible causes and effects of these changes.
Ross, I mean, some of the things that Martin's talking about is quite distinct from what you've been studying, but there are connections between climate change and the movement of invasive species, aren't there? Once you get a warmer world, certain species find it easier maybe to move from south to north and so on?
Absolutely. So biological invasions can interact with other forms of environmental change, such as the climate, or habitat degradation or pollution. So often these stressors on an ecosystem can favour the performance of invasive species. They might be able to better withstand warmer conditions or conditions which are more polluted than our native species. So they can really contribute to the declines of our native ecosystems and the rise of better adapted invasive species. So I think researchers should try and integrate these different fields in terms of climate change, invasions, habitat destruction, because they're not really operating independently. They're all interacting in ways which are often challenging to predict.
You know, for instance, I suppose we might start seeing mosquitoes in Ireland or in Britain that we've never seen before.
Absolutely. I mean, so we already have between 20 and 30 species, depending on which island you're looking at in the British and Irish Isles. We've had the Asian tiger mosquito detected in the south of England a few times now. It's not yet established, but it's been spreading very rapidly across Europe. I was in France last week and was bitten a few times by them, so they're very nearby, and they perform very well in urban areas. They bite during the day and they prefer biting humans, and they're vectors for dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and there's forecasts that they'll arrive in Ireland in the next decades potentially as rates of climate change and urbanisation continue, and we have the trade connections which are likely to bring in the species.
Jaimie, you've gone around the world studying invasive species in all sorts of different countries. Here, though, in our own backyard, we have a big problem with one of our main sources of drinking water, Loch Ness, which has been affected by the zebra mussel, hasn't it? Which is an invasive species which has been working its way through Ireland's waterways in recent decades. Have you got involved in the sort of practical attempts to try and come up with solutions to that problem?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you take zebra mussels, quagga mussels, Asian clam, we have a whole range of experiments where we show that we can actually tackle them by killing them with dry ice, with heat, with chemicals such as Virkon disinfectants. We have a new project funded by DARA, which will look at the use of hydrogen peroxide, which everybody knows is common kind of disinfectant. Here
I should say DARA is the Agriculture and Environment Department here in Northern
Department
Ireland.
of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs here, and using a new catalyst invented very recently in the States and now being produced in Europe. The catalyst speeds up the action of hydrogen peroxide by thousands of times, and we could use that, as they're actually using in the Netherlands, hydrogen peroxide to kill off the cyanobacteria and the toxins, but speed that up and use less hydrogen peroxide to get more of an impact. And that is a project alongside, we have emergence of a new well, not a new, but a previous top predator in Loch Ness, the pike. And the pike may have influences on the fish communities. The zebra mussels have cleared the water, not necessarily of pollutants, but have cleared the water such that light reaches places light didn't used to reach, and that's led to more macrophyte growth, which can lead to more anoxic mud layers. So invasive species, just like Ross has pointed out, interact with pollution, with habitat fragmentation, with climate change, with all these other major juggernauts coming down the line. And one of my views is that there's a lot of things are coming down the line we ain't going to be able to do much about in the immediate term, but invasive species we could be doing a lot more to make sure that their impact isn't accelerated by these other major issues. But we're also working, for example, with nature recovery networks to see if that tackles invasive species. We're working on projects such as the weirs around the rivers of Northern Ireland, which were built for many reasons, to stop water and pool water. If we remove the weirs, we might help our migratory species, but we might also help our invasive species. So we've got to look at the pluses and minuses of all the actions that we take as society, as agriculture, as researchers. And talking about being in France last week and you were being bitten by mosquitoes, I was being bitten by harlequin ladybirds, which is a major invasive species across the world. There was a sudden flush. I was in a chateau in France and we were suddenly covered in harlequin ladybirds on some kind of mating flight. And they got in our clothes, they were in the car, they were in the lady's hair, not mine. And we ended up with an invasive species infesting us, and we don't have that in Ireland. And yet I had to get on a plane, you had to get on a plane and come back from France where we had been bitten and infested by invasives. This is the way...
Did you burn all your clothes?
So I did some biosecurity checks, but this illustrates the point that even top invasion ecologists, if I can call us that, could still end up leading to invasions. There's a classic story of Charles Elton, who is the sort of father of invasion ecology, who was sitting in his desk in Oxford having come back from Egypt, and his wooden buttons started to erupt with little larvae, and little larvae started crawling out onto his desk. So he inadvertently brought a non-native species all the way from Egypt back to Oxford. So these are the sorts of issues we have to deal with. And the change in the speed of ships, the Northern Passage opening up with climate change, this could all lead to more and more invasive species arriving. Tsunamis, which may have been caused by climate change, brought many Japanese species across to the American coasts. So we really have these major interacting factors that we need to tackle. I would say if we could get on top of the invasive species problem, we could reduce a lot of the impacts of climate change, pollution, habitat fragmentation.
It seems clear to me that you believe that in terms of research, it's not enough simply to observe. You also ought to start making suggestions about how that will impact the real world.
And predictions of what will go where, how it will impact. A lot of our work is on impact. How does an invasive predator change the communities around it by, say, faster rates of predation? We did studies in the Netherlands with the killer shrimp, which was a fantastic story of a shrimp from the Ponto-Caspian region has moved across into Western Europe, and it's evolved in a very harsh environment, and it came to quite a benign environment with lots of sort of weaker species in Western Europe, and it's consuming them at much faster rates than the local predators ever consumed them. So we're seeing the impact through the feeding rates of the non-natives compared to the natives. And Ross and I developed many statistical models, graphical models that help us predict which invaders will cause the biggest impacts, and therefore how we can direct limited resources to tackle the real issues rather than perhaps benign. A lot of non-native species are quite benign. A lot of our agriculture is based on non-native species, potatoes and wheat and barley and trees and whatnot, and livestock. So we've got to see the yin and the yang of non-native species.
Ross, some of the work that you've done in relation to the cost, for instance, of invasive species is obviously with a mind to alerting the authorities that maybe this is something that they should be putting more resources into in order to avoid paying more in the long term. Is there a difficulty sometimes with scientists communicating what they know beyond, if you like, the specialist audience of their peers? And how important is that kind of wider process of communication?
Yes, that's exactly why we started the economic cost project. So the ecological impacts can be quite complicated to understand. You can have effects through predation, like Jaimie has studied. You can have effects through hybridization between native and invasive species. You could have effects through pathogens, which are spread to native species, but they're all very different in how they come about. So putting an economic value on these effects was really a communications tool to put a monetary cost on it and something that people can understand. So we're hoping to encourage better management and more sensible management of invasive species. We know that the damages they cause to sectors like agriculture or forestry or fisheries are rising much more rapidly than what we're spending trying to manage them. So we've not really been keeping pace with the extent of the issue. We've also found that how we're managing invasive species isn't very efficient, so we're often being very reactive. So once something's arrived and it's well established, we're then starting to tackle it rather than trying to prevent things from happening in the first place. And we've also shown using mathematical models with some of my collaborations that we can save billions of pounds if we act earlier. So trying to prevent things or rapidly eradicate them once they're first detected rather than delaying any kind of actions towards them. So the monetary costs are really a communications tool, but also trying to inform how to better manage and invest management budgets around the world.
Once you are dealing with a major problem, if you're a government or an agency, might there be a temptation to bring in another species, bring in a predator to try and sort things out? Or is that a case of opening a Pandora's box and you never know what that will lead to?
Well, that's been historically some of the ways really problematic invasive species have arrived, such as the cane toad in Australia. I think often we have very good natural regulation of invasive species, so we could even encourage our natural populations. So if we encourage our native species and conserve them, they can often be a competitive force against invasive species and create what we call biotic resistance, whereby an invasive species tries to arrive, but there's already native species in its place. So often we see invasions occur where we have disturbed landscapes. So if we don't disturb our landscapes and we conserve native biodiversity, naturally we have very good defenses against many invasive species without trying to then introduce more species, which could become problematic in future if not properly screened.
Jaimie, I think you say there are some examples where that's worked, but there's quite a few examples where it hasn't.
Yeah. And to add to Ross's point, I mean, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And currently governments are funding invasion research at the sort of milligram level. It's just not sufficient. And the future problems we're storing up for ourselves economically, animal and human and plant health are absolutely enormous. And there's so many different invaders on the way that we know about, we have predicted, we know what will happen if they get here. Where is the prevention? I can give you anecdote after anecdote. My colleague in the south of Ireland, Joe Caffrey, worked for Inland Fisheries Ireland. He was sitting at Dublin Port and he thought he saw a lorry load of beer coming in called harp, but it wasn't, it was carp. And there was a lorry load of fish came from England and were driven around the south of Ireland and tipped into the local lakes and rivers. Is it any surprise we now have the crayfish plague? Is it any surprise we now have invasive chub, we have invasive quagga mussels? And this is not being stopped at the ports or the airports or people like you and I coming back from France with mosquitoes and hard-looking ladybirds. And we also need to see the legislation is quite out of date. So most of the legislation towards nature, if you want to call it that, was to protect nature. So the Wildlife Order 1985 that is relevant to Northern Ireland was written in the 70s. It's the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 81 with some amendments for Northern Ireland. It is now being used to protect invasive species because by the letter of that law, you can't, for example, cull animals during the night because apparently that's not what you should be doing towards deer populations because we're trying to protect deer. But we have invasive deer which will cause massive ecological, economic and disease impacts that are being protected under outdated legislation. So these are major barriers we need to move on, and that's what frustrates us as the scientists who come along with the data, the predictions, the patterns at a global level, local level, and then see stumbling blocks, lack of funding, lack of imagination, out-of-date legislation, which leads to the next invasion which will happen. And once they've happened, they're very difficult, unless you've got a rapid reaction force. Where's our rapid reaction force? We've been calling for this. We used to go to meetings, Invasive Species Ireland, and we used to talk about all the progress. And we used to always have what's the least thing that we've progressed on? Well, the rapid reaction force is the slowest part of this project. It's quite an irony the most effective part of the project was simply not happening. I have ways and thoughts on how that can happen, but I have trouble talking to the government and the legislators and the officials into how to put that into actual practical action. You've also got the problem of politics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year cycles of politics. A lot of it is fingers in the ear, la 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 la, it'll go away or someone else will inherit it. That has to stop. We need long-term thinking, decadal thinking.
So in a sense, the communication of science and what's going on is as important as the pure research, because if
the communication's happening, it's just not being listened to, is in my view. The communication is most certainly there in all the different ways, whether it's scientific publications, conferences, policy papers we produce to government to give them summaries, bringing people to do part-time PhDs, giving them access to the library. We've done a whole range of activities to try to get to government and the officials in charge to change their behaviour. They can't say they don't get the communication from us. I'd say that's a false narrative. They are getting the communication from us.
Martin, you agree that applies to your sphere as well?
It reminds me of climate change. Scientists have been saying this since the 1970s at least, and now you see that politicians are actually starting to listen and thinking of possible ways of reducing CO2 emission or capturing CO2, but then other things happen. So for a while it goes well, and then we start seeing that it actually costs money to do these things. So then other things become more important. So I see lots of parallels with what you were describing.
Ross, we've been talking about communicating science to wider society. That's only one of the challenges, though, that you face, no doubt, in terms of continuing with your research. What kind of challenges are you facing right now?
I think in the field at large is prediction. So we know which species we currently have are invasive, but we don't necessarily have a good understanding of what's going to be coming in the pipeline. So there's challenges and there's opportunities. So the challenge can be addressed using species characteristics which are already here. So we can look at the traits or characteristics of species which are currently causing problems locally, and then we can look at which species have similar traits globally, and they might be the next ones to come in and cause issues. And there's lots of opportunities with new advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence to make predictions that we weren't able to make before. So again, linking into kind of cross-disciplinary collaborations. That requires working with mathematicians, computer scientists, which we wouldn't encounter day to day in our school. So it's another opportunity to reach out to work with different disciplines to try and predict responses to environmental change or the next invasions which are likely to occur in the future.
So at your level, you're not worried about artificial intelligence putting you out of business. It's instead a useful tool that you can bring to bear on
Absolutely,
what you're studying.
Yeah, it's developing very fast, and it can be used to really improve our understandings of the natural environment, as long as we interpret the outcomes with care and do appropriate sensitivity analyses and so on. I think it's a tool that can be used really effectively.
Martin, what challenges would you face in terms of your chronological work? I know, for instance, like contamination can really knock you off a picture, can't it, in terms of getting an accurate picture of what's been going on?
Yes. So radiocarbon dating can be used back to 50,000 years ago or so, and that's say between 30 and 50,000 years ago was a period with enormous changes in climate, and also say Neanderthals became extinct, modern humans went to many different areas, and that can be dated. But if you have a tiny bit of contamination, it can throw dates off a lot, because by that time there's only very little radiocarbon left. So that's something that I really would like to work on more. There's several case studies where we expected dates to be around a certain age, and they're just scattered and much too young. But also in more recent periods, you have a lake which is otherwise dated using lead-210 or pollen, and then your radiocarbon dates are totally off, and we simply do not know why. So that's one area that I would like to work on, and we have a new equipment in our lab where we have an oven, and we increase the temperature of the oven, and each time, every 100 degrees, we isolate the sample and radiocarbon date it. And that enables us to pry open this black box of carbon in lake sediment, for example. It's still a black box, but instead of one black box, it's like 8 black boxes. And then we hopefully can get a better understanding of what carbon goes in there and what is the age actually, because that's still more often a problem than we would want it to be. But for that, ways to go about is, say, new analytical techniques, but also mathematical techniques. So we have one of my collaborators who used to be my PhD student. He developed a really beautiful mathematical model to look at lead to 10 dating. Lead to 10 dating works for the past 150 years. It's really difficult to combine that with radiocarbon, which works further back in time. And up to his research, it was not possible to connect the two. But then he made a beautiful Bayesian model which simply combines the two in one framework. And that's actually really being taken up by lots of people in the community. They really are excited by that new development. And it's better quantification of the uncertainties we have and doing better in that respect. So that's a challenge, but it's also possible to actually make progress in that.
Jaimie, I suppose it's a question of balancing the challenges and the opportunities, because as Ross was saying, new methodologies, new technology can open out all sorts of different possibilities now.
I think we're in that zone of necessity has been the mother of invention. And the challenge is to make sure, for example, at a local level, we are learning the international experience. And that's, for example, why I was on a call last night for 2 hours from 9 p.m. with the New Zealanders who have suffered a massive outbreak of an invasive species that we actually tackled to some degree in Ireland, and I'm giving them advice on how to do that in New Zealand. New Zealanders have come up with all sorts of innovative techniques, such as the Judas goat, where the GPS collared goats let the goats go. They associated with their kin, and they were culled, and we managed to remove all the goats from islands, and the biodiversity is recovering. We're using thermal drones and thermal binoculars at the moment to assess populations of invasive species and native species, and then target culls or target interventions. So there's a lot out there, and the challenge is at any particular place in the world, let's take Ireland, what can we learn from the international experience? And for example, the invasion rate into the Great Lakes of North America was something like a new species every 16 weeks through ballast water. Ballast water exchange at sea, the use of ozone and other quarantine techniques has led to maybe one invader over 2.5 years. So there's international lessons we have to learn. The challenge is with parochial, let's be honest about it, legislation, parochial outlooks, mindsets, misinformation, movements such as animal rights extremism. These are getting in the way of us implementing those very solutions across the world that we need to implement. And I think that's the big challenge now, is to bring us all together at the global level and tackle these issues head on and not piecemeal here and there. And that's the challenge, or we will simply waste the resources on tackling something poorly and the problem recurring, rather than tackling the problem head on over, I would say, centuries to come. So that's the major challenge I see.
I know you're all teaching academics. Do you see teaching as something that gets in the way of your vital research, or something that's integral to what you do?
We engage at all levels in teaching. It's a two-way street. We get a better product for Queen's that goes out into the various departments that we hope down the line will be more imaginative, because there are students, and also those students can often become our new PhD students who have research skills to get out there and become, the higher echelons of consultancy, of academia, of government. So I'm very much a fan of engaging at all levels of education within the School of Biological Sciences and across the university.
Martin, do you agree? Is it a two-way street for you?
Certainly, and also I think it's very important that we are working across disciplines in education and in research, and I think that's so natural. It's so beneficial to learn from multiple disciplines, and for students also to go take modules in different schools, see how other people think, and yeah, whenever I do teaching, I do that across all levels. I learn a lot myself as well that I can apply in my research. That happens very frequently. One of the modules I coordinate is on environmental change, and it was originally meant for archaeology students and paleoecology, but it's very popular with geography students, environmental management, and also other students, so across faculties, and I really enjoyed that.
Now, there's a lot of groundbreaking knowledge that we've been discussing here, but do you get annoyed at any time, Ross, when you're looking at, if you like, the wider media, that there's still an awful lot of pseudoscience out there and things where people put 2 and 2 together and make 6?
Occasionally, yeah, things can be taken out of context when you're communicating with the media. So I think you need to be very careful at times in terms of what you're saying. You're staying very objective to try and minimize any kind of misinterpretation of the messages. I think in terms of invasions, it's been quite difficult because it's quite a complicated environmental change compared to things like climate. There's multiple stages and there's lots of different terminology for sometimes the same thing. So I think in our field we have a lot of jargon sometimes, and that can lead to confusion both with the media and general public. So we've been involved in projects recently to try and harmonise all of that jargon and to come up with consistent terms we use to try and avoid public confusion, because we can refer to species as being alien, as non-native, as non-indigenous, and so on, and ultimately they mean the same thing. So trying to bring all that together and harmonise can help to avoid confusion, I think, with terminology in the media.
I know in terms of your chronological work that you've occasionally had to kind of counter theories that maybe have not necessarily had that much basis in real science.
Yes, so 65 million years ago, comet impact kills all the dinosaurs.
We've all heard that story.
Yes, and some of my software has been used in actually dating that to say actually 66 million years ago. But the fact that a comet impact took place, which is well known, it doesn't mean that any other event is also explained by a comet impact. And currently there are several cases where events in human history or possible mythical events are explained by a comet impact, for which there actually is hardly any evidence. I actually came across that comet impact having caused the Younger Dryas. I came across that in 2007 when I just arrived here in Belfast. We had an international researcher come over and talk about it, and initially I was very interested until I saw the data and when I saw all the problems with the radiocarbon dates, and then I just thought it didn't add up. But that is currently, it's a common part of public imagination, where people are saying that the Younger Dryas was caused by a comet impact. It's out there in the social media, it's on TV shows, and when my students in first year start talking about the Younger Dryas, they will say it has been caused by a comet impact. But in academia, we think it's not really necessary to invoke a comet impact. There's no evidence. There's more down-to-earth mechanisms to explain the event. So we then have to, I have to re-teach the students that there's other mechanisms as well, which are much more, reliable.
And is that because the kind of precise chronology that you're looking at doesn't really gel with some of the stories that are put about?
Yeah, because so sometimes I say, okay, radiocarbon dates could be wrong. Yes, I work with that every day, but it doesn't mean that when they find a certain archaeological structure that is dated to 5,000 years ago, it doesn't mean that because the radiocarbon dates could be wrong, that is certainly of Younger Dryas age, right? So it's exploiting these uncertainties or the could-bes, but I'm all for quantifying uncertainties. That's my whole career, is on quantifying uncertainties, but it doesn't mean that you then can use that much elastics to just fit all your data or all your things to your theory.
Jaimie, when you go back into your lab tomorrow, What's the thing you're trying to achieve right now?
I think what one of my major jobs and my pleasures of the job is the large number of students and postdocs, technicians and people that we supervise. And that's across our freshwater work, our marine work, our terrestrial work, master's students, honours students at this time of the year. It's those bright young things and their development and their research and their thinking and their critical ways of going about experiments and surveys. Dealing with that, Ross and I are constantly on the phone, WhatsApp groups, emails, getting out in the field ourselves, getting our hands dirty, getting involved with the projects. So that's, I'll probably have a whole pile of slightly panicky students looking for direction, and that's what we will do. And we run it with a lot of independence for people, as well as guidance, and sometimes sit them down and re-evaluate and take new directions. There's the funding elements of it. There's the writing, and there's the reporting back to funders. There's a lot of annual reviews and whatnot we go through. So that's maintaining that group of people and that diverse network, plus our international network, which we involve ourselves a lot with. So we'll be down in Dublin next week. I've done my New Zealand advisory the other day. You've done France recently with your workshops. We're planning our new conference, which is coming to Belfast in 2026, the International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species. And that's going to be a 2-year lead into a major 400, 500 people conference coming to Belfast to knowledge transfer, give the latest science, talk about policy, all the things we've discussed. So we'll probably be doing some of that later on today. So it's a wonderful job in the diversity, and but it's the people that really make that.
Yeah, Ross, right now, which species are you zoning in on, or which fields might you be trekking around with a pair of wellies on?
Yeah, I focus on a variety of different taxonomic groups. So I think that's one of the aspects of invasion biology. It's not focused on invasive plants, invasive insects, invasive vertebrates. It's really everything. All taxa have some kind of invasion history. So I have projects with Jaimie working on invasive plants like Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam, but I have projects working on native mosquito species, which could become problematic in future with climate change. I have other projects which are more at the macro-ecological scale, so looking at global data sets, including all biological invasions across different taxa. I have projects working on biodiversity finance as well in relation to global change. So I think that's one of the main attractions of the job, just the variety of projects you can get involved in and guide students through.
And yourself, Martin, right now, what are you working on?
Research projects I'm working on at the moment. One on tropical peat. So there's lots of peatlands in tropical regions.
Because we tend to think of them as being in places like Ireland, but actually there's different kinds of peatlands in the jungles of the southern hemisphere.
Yes, and we know very little about them, like how long have they been accumulating over. So one thing is that we're going to do a lot of radiocarbon dating on them, different components, and see what we can best learn from these peatlands in the tropical regions.
Jaimie, do you have a favourite invasive species, or are they all aliens to be abhorred?
I think one of the ones that sticks out is Dicrogammarus villosus, which people thought was named after me, but it's actually not, and it's the killer shrimp that came across I mentioned earlier. It's actually reached Cambridgeshire as well. It's found in Grafham Water, and it was one of those discoveries of a species in the Netherlands, actually in the IJsselmeer in the Netherlands, and how it was interacting with local species. We got a lot of publicity. The BBC was all over us, lots of interviews. We got grants through the results. We get excellent papers and studentships, and the killer shrimp always has a sort of a place in my heart for its voracious, nasty nature, and something that we could have prevented, but didn't, because again the failure of, let's say, the other half of this equation, which is what we do on the ground, how governments respond, fund, what imagination is there, and that invasion has continued throughout Europe. It'll reach Ireland. We've predicted several species will reach Ireland, and they have. In fact, we did a horizon scan. One of our jobs is to do these horizon scans, see what's coming. And we did a horizon scan of invasive species in Ireland, and we have a top 10. And within a few weeks of that being published, there was 1 or 2 of the top 10 had arrived in Ireland. So we're doing our bit I think other people need to step up or we're going to have more and more problems.
That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. It's been fantastic hearing about the work you do and the difference you're making in the world. This has been the Queen's University Belfast Research to Reality Roundtable. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us.